Max, the other day I was doing a little bit of an Instagram post. I'm currently doing my sports dietitian accreditation. I thought it'd be interesting for people to listen along and be like, oh, okay, cool. What's Matt learning about? And we were learning about protein, the ever more increasing topic of relevance in today's current nutrition sphere. Protein is extremely interesting, but I think there's a little bit of misconceptions. And the questions that I got from my Instagram were that people generally had pretty good questions related to protein that weren't so far off. So I find the general understanding is pretty decent. However, there were some areas where it's like, okay, there's definitely some education that can see benefit from going towards. So I thought, hey, let's have a podcast about it. Let's delve into protein, a bunch of different questions long. It's very going to, not much going to be a very structured, just very in depth in terms of answering what you guys want to know, what your questions have been about protein.
Yeah, most definitely, man. Yeah, 100%. I think pretty good summary, really. I think the overall people tend to know most things, what sort of foods contain protein in them. Even could be as much as how much protein you should be eating every day, how many times you should eat protein every day, things like that. I think people tend to have a decent understanding in. It could just be the extension of that, could be learning about things like complete versus incomplete protein sources, how you can combine two incomplete protein sources to make a complete protein source, maybe the difference in protein powder versus a whole food source of protein. That could be something that probably people could, what I think would be like the best things for people to learn about.
Absolutely. Let's put a pin in that, exactly whole food versus other ones, and let's jump through. Would you like to start with that? What is the difference between whole food protein versus powdered protein? Can I just eat powdered protein? Would you like to take that away?
Well, I guess in my opinion, that's the trick question, right? Is that people think there's a difference when probably there really isn't much at all, if we really look into it deep enough. Of course, there is some difference to some degree, but I think if you were to survey most of the population, they would presume there's a significant difference and there's got to be something wrong with it, or just doesn't feel right. I have a bad gut feeling about it, when it's like, it's pretty much just the same as just any other protein source. So in my opinion, it's a lack of difference is probably the biggest thing that people are getting wrong. Would you say your experience has been the same?
I don't know. So I find that people put protein powders on a pedestal, in the sense that it's better than just a whole food, because like it absorbs quicker and it does this, and then you can adjust this and it's more convenient and this and that and blah blah blah. And I find that there's pros and cons to every situation. Protein powder is one of them. The pros of protein powder is that it's very convenient, it's very cheap to increase your protein intake, it's very useful, and it's an amazing tool that we can incorporate into our lives. I find that a lot of people should be supplementing with it. I wouldn't say majority of the population, but I think a large proportion of the population would see benefit from increasing their protein intake via primarily whole foods. And if not, supplementation is an option to increase our diet via supplementing it, not via replacing some whole food. So the key difference between whole proteins from whole foods and proteins from supplements is that with the whole protein from the whole food, we get all the things that come along with the protein. If we were to isolate, I just want beef protein just by itself, and then, hey, I just want whey protein, they're going to be pretty decent either or choice that you make. But if I had the choice, I would sit down and have the whole steak. One, because it's nummy in my tummy, and then two, because it actually provides a lot more nutrients overall. Iron, B12, additional micronutrients that are quite important, has some beneficial fat profiles, not all of them. We can delve that into that another day. But I think that's the main point of protein intake, is that if we're just relying on protein powders for our food, what are we replacing? What are we displacing? What are we removing from our diet? And I think that often gets swept under the rug, because it's not really a question that we think about very often.
Yeah, for sure. 100%. I like what you were saying about, supplementing. I tend to think of protein powder more as a meal replacement rather than a supplement. And look, it's semantics at this point, in the sense that it doesn't really matter. But if we try to view meals as a bodybuilder or as someone, trying to gain muscle or change the way they look, which is typically what people, if you're focusing on protein, typically you're trying to think about changing the way you look or your body composition to some degree, because would you agree with that overall? Like, people looking to gain more muscle, lose fat, whatever it is, they tend to gravitate towards protein overall?
Generally, yeah. But I would disagree with your statement that it's a meal replacement, because I think that only applies to the bodybuilding and sport performance population.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, okay. Yeah, so like but the reason why I really like the word supplement that you just used then, which is probably the more common term, is the supplement can help to make things more sustainable. I think using the two S words work really well. And that if you can supplement your life, it can actually help to make it more sustainable, which is the name of the game in the end. In the sense that if you weren't using the supplement, that's fine, but it might mean that if you're struggling to keep up your protein intake and have enough protein each and every day, it's going to make it less sustainable and more likely for you to crash and burn or not be able to stick to it for most days. Whereas if you are regularly supplementing, it might actually mean that you can continue to do it forever or for a significantly longer period of time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, sorry, please go on, Max.
Yeah, look, I think overall your key differences in protein powder is going to be the absorption rate, in my opinion. That's going to be probably your biggest difference. Take us through that, Matt.
Yeah, look, it's a bit of a slippery slope with this one. So generally, when we consume protein, we only, let's say, utilize 10 to 20% for muscle protein synthesis, full stop. A good 50-ish% goes to the splanchnic. I don't even know if I'm pronouncing that properly, but to the really high turnover rate tissues being your gastrointestinal system. And then some of the protein tends to be like, okay, cool. Once that's ticked off, then some can go to muscle protein synthesis once everything else is taken care of, like your organs and major functioning parts and things along those lines. Certain proteins have higher bioavailability. They're absorbed a little bit easier by the body. They're processed a little bit easier. They tend to be the more animal-based proteins. I'm sure someone with a higher degree than myself in terms of nutrition science or something along those lines can really go down into the nitty gritty in terms of why certain foods are more bioavailable, certain proteins are more bioavailable. But what my key point of argument would be, leucine is an incredibly important amino acid. So for people who aren't aware, protein is comprised of amino acids. It's a large amount of amino acids, usually a complex amount of them. And they're kind of the building blocks of protein. And we break those proteins down to get amino acids for specific purposes around the body. Leucine is just one of those incredibly important resources and amino acids for muscle protein synthesis in general. There was previously a minimum leucine threshold that was thought to be occurring. Now it's more so like, okay, generally once we hit about a 3-gram leucine threshold, then the total protein matters a little bit more. But of course, there's a lot of nuance in the situation. Are you isocaloric or eucaloric? Are you reducing your total body weight on a period of time? Are you eating protein throughout the day in multiple different instances? What's the type of meal that you're combining with? Lots of different factors go into the scenario, and it's not as clear cut as, hey, you need to eat 1.6 grams a kilo of protein per body weight per day, otherwise your limbs are going to fall off. It's okay. There's a little bit more nuance. We need to kind of peel back the layers and understand what's actually going on. How much are we getting from this adjustment to here, this modification from, let's say, changing from 1 meal a day to 4 meals a day? Is it 5% difference? Is it 10% difference? Depends on you in a lot of instances. Max, that was a bit of a ramble by me. Did that make any sense?
Mostly. I think the important thing to understand about the whole minimum leucine threshold thing, again, it's probably something that you wouldn't have heard of unless you've been doing or in this field, in this sphere for quite a long time. It was more popular back, say, 4 or 5 years ago or so, and it's died off quite a lot. What the consensus was back then was that, yeah, sure, even if it does matter, that 3 or so grams of leucine, as you were talking about, per meal, that's great. You pretty much get 3 grams in any source of protein ever if you have like 30 to 40 grams of protein in your meal, which you should be having every meal pretty much anyway. So it's like, well, you don't really need to focus on it if you just get it by proxy of having the amount of protein you should be having at every meal anyway. So it kind of just doesn't really make any sense to focus on it, in the sense that having more than your 3 grams doesn't really seem to do anything anyway. And you will be getting your 3 grams no matter what sort of protein source you eat, even if it is plant-based protein sources. Just by sheer volume of having that much protein, you're going to be getting enough leucine in anyway. So that's kind of the whole thinking of, and why no one really cares about it. Overall, the one thing I was just thinking about that was just the biggest thing in the absorption rates, and that your protein powder is very likely to absorb a lot faster and at a lot faster rate in comparison to your other protein sources, which is something that can be utilized and something that you can take advantage of, because there are pros and cons to having faster absorbing protein. Like, you wouldn't want to have it just before bed at night for obvious reasons.
I've heard that argument before, and we've made that argument before, but I've almost come on a bit of a U-turn on my statement there, where I think having protein full stop before you go to bed is by far the most important factor. And then once you get into like the nitty gritty of okay, do I want a whey protein powder, which is a lot higher rate of absorption and distribution into our bloodstream, or do I want something like a casein, which is kind of a different version of a milk protein, which can absorb a little bit slower? Or do I step it up a notch and be like, okay, do I want the same amount of protein but in the form of yogurt, which will be including some fats as well as some carbohydrates, which would potentially slow it down even further. But then, of course, there's a little bit of nuance in the situation. Does that fit into your daily caloric intake goals? If you are tracking that kind of situation, if you're in that sporting performance environment, overall, it's much more important to get the protein in full stop. And then you can start to think about, okay, maybe I can have some adjustment. Maybe I can potentially get some calcium in as well through some yogurts or something along those lines, or potentially have another meal. But in them, factoring in, is that meal going to impact your sleep? Is it too high in fats? Is it too high in carbohydrates? A lot of nuance in these kind of situations. Remember to check the link in the description or our website for our consultations. Back to it.
That's exactly what I was going to say, is that if you're relying on the fats and the carbohydrates, especially the fats, to slow down the digestion, which the fats will, you've also really got to take into account how much are these fats that we're having going to be impacting the sleep quality, because you'd never want to purposefully slow down digestion with via fats, because we know how potent fats are at disrupting our sleep overall, which is going to be the most important thing. That when we're looking at the list of priorities, your sleep's always going to prioritize over having a meal that might slightly digest a little bit slower over the course of the night. That's just way out of whack. You don't have your priorities straight. I noticed your language was really good, and I really like. I hope there were some viewers at least that may have picked up on. You always talked about absorption and you never mentioned about utilization, because they're two very, very different things. Can you delve into absorption versus utilization, please, Matt?
I think actually you would be the best one to take us through that one there.
Okay. Yeah, sure. Look. Again, the reason why I asked you is because I don't really know much about it overall. I just know that the biggest thing that I have is, my couple sentences that I can kind of get by with that does enough to explain it rather than actually be able to deep dive into it. But essentially, the rough thing is that our bodies absorb all the protein we eat all the time. So we absorb, as close to 100% of the protein we eat as possible. Definitely not 100%, but it's very close to it. And that just means we're extracting the calories out of it and absorbing everything for the food we're consuming. Now, the amount we utilize is going to be very different. So the incorrect question is, if I have 100 grams of protein at a given meal, am I going to be absorbing it? The answer is always yes, you're going to be absorbing all those 100 grams. The correct question is, how much of that am I actually going to be utilizing? And that's more of a nuance. That's more of a nuanced question. And it will depend on a bunch of different factors. Whether you've been physically active that day or over the previous days, what type of physical activity it is as well, even as down to like what muscle groups you've been using. Has it been a full body training session, or has it just been biceps, or has it been legs, which takes up a lot more musculature overall? There's some things that's going to impact the amount you're going to utilize. And typically, from what I've read, depending on a bunch of different factors, it could be anywhere between 20 to 40 grams, sometimes even more, is the amount of protein that you would utilize in any given meal.
Interesting. Yeah, I'm not entirely familiar with the utilization rates. I think it depends on how much total protein that you're intaking and that a period of time. My general understanding is it's about 10 to 20% goes to muscle protein synthesis, specifically for myofibrillar and mitochondrial protein synthesis. But look, again, exactly those situations. If you do not provide the stimulus for protein to be allocated to those specific tissues, you will not get protein applying and incorporating them into your muscles or tissue that you're really aiming for them to, without having the stimulus. So that was a bit rambly. Let me rephrase that. Without the correct stimulus for muscle protein synthesis from exercise or resistance training, the protein that you ingest will not go to the required tissues that you're trying to target.
Yep.
A little bit of nuance with that one. It technically does boost muscle protein synthesis when you have a meal about 20 plus grams in protein, but the extent of total muscle protein synthesis being the amount that you build that muscle, or repair it in some cases, is dwarfed in comparison to that plus exercise. Like it's night and day. And the same applies for bone mass as well. If you're not applying an appropriate amount of appropriate stress to your bones, not like you're smashing it with a hammer or something, but doing resistance training, performing squats, that signal to our bone cells, I'm not going to pretend like I'm familiar with that aspect, is incredibly important to facilitate the movement of calcium from our bloodstream into our bones themselves.
Yeah, for sure. Look, again, we could talk for a long, long time about all the benefits of resistance training overall. Bone health is a massive one. It's going to be a really, really big play. Matthew, I asked you quite a few questions in that. Take us through. I think one of the ones I was interested about was, I was just curious about other organ health other than kidneys. We've probably talked ad nauseum. Maybe we could go in it again today, but I feel like we have talked ad nauseum about kidney health overall in this podcast and the role that protein has on our kidney health. But what about some other organs? What about your liver? What about your heart? Is protein having an impact on these other organs, these other vital organs? Your brain?
Let's touch on one key detail. I think the heart is quite interesting. So something I've personally experienced from some clients of mine is that they've had potentially a heart attack in the past, and their recommendations from the cardiologist, despite the dietitian in the hospital's recommendations, has been to lose weight rapidly. That sounds ridiculous. If you have a trauma event of any kind, the dietitian is most likely going to say, hey, we need to maintain your weight as exactly as it is right now. We need to maintain the amount of energy intake that you're having to the point where you're not losing weight, and potentially even increase it if you have higher energy demands, because we want to make sure that the rate of repair of your cells is as efficient and as quick as possible. It would be ridiculous to say the same for someone who's had a heart attack where cells have been damaged because you've lost oxygen supply to those heart cells. The cells have then damaged or died, and then, okay, no, but you need to lose weight, which means that the rate of repair of those cells is going to be reduced. That just makes absolutely no sense to me. If you have a heart attack, yes, you do need to lose weight eventually, because it's most likely going to be improving your situation from a cardiovascular health perspective. However, the important factor is you need to maintain your weight in the time that it takes to repair the damage of your heart. Look, it tends to range in terms of the amount of damage that has occurred, but I would say it's a general rule of thumb. I would wait for about 2 months at minimum post the heart attack or major adverse cardiac event before you start aiming to gradually lose weight in an appropriate and slow enough manner where you're not depleting the rest of your body of your lean body mass stores.
Okay. Yeah, I love it. So just to be super duper clear, there's no direct link between protein and impact on heart health. And the other thing is, post these traumatic events, as Matthew was saying, our body spends a lot of energy on essentially restorative repair, really, getting ourselves back to being in a healthy homeostatic state, really. And that used a lot of energy and it used a lot of fuel. And what inadvertently happens is your energy requirements actually increase from that. So what Matthew was saying was that you either want to be having the same amount of food or even adjust up to meet your new energy requirements, which are going to be elevated for a short amount of time whilst your body is doing all that repair work.
Absolutely.
So that's good to know. Yeah.
Sorry to jump on that.
No.
Some thoughts may be, okay, well, if I need more energy, maybe I'll just eat even more than I need and potentially gain weight. We know that if you gain weight during the repair process, it does impede the ability for our body to repair those specific tissues that have been damaged. So the fuel allocation will go to storage rather than repair, which is, I'm not entirely sure of the mechanisms at play, but that's just what we do notice in terms of the literature and the evidence in clinical situations.
Yeah, 100%. Really the goal for all this. And our bodies as a general rule of thumb, our bodies like being at caloric maintenance overall. That's what I've noticed with just about everything I see, really, in terms of our bodies reacting best as a general rule of thumb. I think when we're eukcaloric or out of caloric maintenance, that's when things tend to go wrong the least amount.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, they're very, very big creatures of habit, Max. Yeah. One question you asked me. Sorry, please go on.
Yes, go. No, yeah. I'm sure. I want to keep doing questions. It's fun.
One question you asked me was, can you gain muscle by only eating protein? I thought that is a great question. And
no, I didn't ask that. That was someone else.
Oh, that must have been someone else. Oh, beaten to the
That was a
punch there, Max.
viewer.
Beautiful. The 3 viewers that commented, thank you very much. I appreciated those. Max had a bit of a field day. I think there's 20 questions from Max. Can you gain muscle by only eating protein? This would be under the assumption that you're having enough total energy to reach your daily energy requirements. And let's say that temporarily you have enough total fat storage that you're not going to impede your hormone function, and that you have sufficient gluconeogenesis from protein turning into glucose to then supply your muscles with enough to get through the workout to actively provide enough of a stimulus. And then, yes, technically you can build muscle by only eating protein as your main fuel source. Let's say if you had like a magic pill that has all of your different micronutrients, except for your essential fatty acids, and then you just had protein powder for the rest. Technically, yes. Is going to be optimal? Absolutely not. That's ridiculous. It's definitely not the case in any type of scenario. I think you're missing out a lot in terms of being able to provide a lot of energy in behind the scenes for carbohydrate use in specifically sport performance applications. It's just, why would you even consider that an appropriate method of achieving your goals, unless you have an autoimmune dysfunction where you can only eat protein or something along those lines, which generally come around very rarely. I would say very sub 0.5% of the population.
The reality is it doesn't even matter like what the answer is. You know, the answer is almost definitely, it's just like, as you were saying, it's nuanced, but basically no. You're not going to be able to eat only protein anyway. It's just the reality. Like, no one can keep that up. And again, the only people that probably could keep it up would be someone that their life depended on it for whatever reason or another. And so it's like for me, what that tells me is you're asking the wrong questions at this point. You just don't know enough to know that that's just an impossible thing to do. So we need to really strip things back and get your knowledge around like what actually do you think protein is? Like, what foods do you think have protein in them? How do you think you'd be able to go about having an exclusively protein diet? Because I bet you someone that thinks like that, which is fine. Like everyone has knowledge deficits. That's absolutely fine. But that person might think that, you know, bread is pure protein or something like that. So like they'd be able to consume only protein through bread or whatever it is. Or whatever it was, you know, just in the sense that like you're not going to be able to only consume protein. If you're having animal products to some extent, there's going to be fats within the protein. You know, if you're having any sort of you know, for example, like yogurts or whatever it is, there's going to be carbohydrates mixed in with the protein. It's just a reality. So you can have a predominantly protein diet, but it's never going to be exclusively protein.
Yeah, absolutely. In the same sense that every food has a balance of pros and cons. Every food has a balance of primarily 3 main macronutrients, being fats, carbohydrates, and proteins. Some foods are definitely higher than others. Some foods are definitely lower than others. Just do your research and find out which foods are working towards the goals that you set, or have a chat to us and we can help you with that. No problems at all. Or you can just come through all of our content.
And just on the pros and cons thing, that's exactly what we were referring to with the protein powder. You know, the protein powder absorbing quicker has pros and cons. The pros is that you could probably utilize it in the morning to get a quick absorption, or around your training sessions to utilize the quick absorption that it comes with and make it to your advantage, rather than have it at night when it's just going to be to your disadvantage really overall. So that's what we're getting at. We didn't explain that properly.
Yeah.
Next question, Matthew.
Having protein at night. But anyways, jumping back onto does protein impact the rest of my organs? Not in a negative way. There's pretty much no evidence to support that an increased amount of protein intake could potentially negatively impact your organs overall, unless you have some form of already existing liver damage or kidney damage or some strange conditions that I'm not familiar with that may impede your ability to process protein into glucose, and that may end up building up certain amino acids in the bloodstream, which is very, very, very rare. If you had that, you would know about it because you would be constantly sick and your doctors would be yelling at you for it. Not yelling at you, but you get what I mean. So overall, protein just seems to be a pretty positive thing in terms of rate of repair. It's the building blocks of the body. So of course, applying enough protein to your dietary intake can supply the building blocks to repair any daily damage that comes along, and potentially build up stronger muscle stores, which of course we need to maintain our health span and longevity throughout life.
For sure. I've never thought about this before, so I probably shouldn't say it, but I think protein should probably be the cornerstone of everyone's meals when they're thinking of what they're going to eat. So like
Yes.
you're thinking about, okay, what am I going to have for lunch? Let's start with protein and let's get that set. So we've got a good source of protein in our meal, and then everything else can kind of come from there. Maybe that's dumb.
I don't think that's dumb at all. I think that's a perfectly appropriate way of thinking about it. However, I need to acknowledge that sometimes we can have foods that we don't need to focus on protein as the main source of nutrients. Like it's perfectly fine to mix up every now and then, especially if we're not bodybuilding as our main goal. Sure. Having like a salad that has a relatively lower amount of protein is perfectly fine every now and then. Or having like, I don't know, your fries when you're going out for a Friday night with the boys or whatever. Look, I'm not going to stress about like a one event where we're missing, but overall, as long as we're getting on average consistent protein on a daily basis spread throughout the day, throughout the week, throughout the month, I think that seems to be a little bit more appropriate.
Yeah, 100% agree, man. Love it.
Yeah.
Let's keep these questions coming.
Should I eat less protein on a rest day?
Yeah, love this one. And for me, the answer is just simply no. I think people muck around with rest days too much, man. I've seen people, they drop their calories, they change a lot. It's like, yeah, like, sure, you can play around with, maybe decrease your calories by like 200 calories, whatever it is, depending on what you would expect their training session to be in terms of a caloric load. But I think just keep it the same. Like, it's not going to be a big deal overall. And you can make an argument for either way in that one of the arguments being like, just stop stressing about everything so much, man. Like you need to take a chill pill if you're worrying that much about these tiny details. Yeah. Just do your thing, and you need to spend less time stressing and more time learning how to relax and unwind, because those types of questions, for me, those types of questions, and this is just purely from experience, for like personal experience, in that when I'm asking those sorts of questions, I'm strung up, I'm highly strung, and I'm trying to optimize everything and make everything perfect, and to just sit back, relax, and do your thing, and not be so freaking out about everything. But then the other thing is like, well, like, look, if I can optimize it, let's optimize it,
Yeah, absolutely. Look, again, pros and cons, you got to balance out. Is the amount of change worth the stress that it causes or potential mental fatigue? Yeah. And then acknowledging what your limitations are as a person and what you realistically can cope with. I think being aware of that situation can be really useful in planning out how your days, your months are meant to go.
Quick ad break, guys. Remember to click the first link in the description to check out our dietitian consultations and services. Back to it.
100%. Yeah. And I think in this case, probably, you can set it up. So for example, if you were to set up, okay, every rest day I have 200 less calories, so that's not difficult decision fatigue or mental fatigue overall. You just know that every single rest day that's the case. And I wouldn't drop your protein, but you might, I would just drop it from the carbs instead. So I think the answer is no.
You could almost do the exact same thing effective-wise by just increasing the total amount of energy intake on your training days by including a pre and post exercise meal. And then by extension, on your training days, your rest days, you're not eating those meals, so your calories are effectively reduced in terms of, as well as potential protein. I wouldn't really muck around with protein too much. I think it should be pretty consistent, but total carbohydrates can be a little bit variable.
I love that idea. I love it. It does imply you're having a meal plan, which is, you could be. I'd probably recommend it personally.
Meal vibe.
Yeah. But the other thing that I would actually personally recommend would be try and have a 200 calorie intra for your training. I think me and Matthew differ on our opinions on intras a little bit, but have a 200 calorie intra. And that means that when you're on your rest days, you don't need an intra because you're not training. And then there's your 200 less calories kind of thing. And the intras are only going to be carbohydrates anyway, which is what you want to pull from. Reason being is because on your rest days, if you want to
know what an intra is,
what did you do the 2 days prior?
DM us, we'll have a conversation about that.
Not rest days. You were training. And so your body's still repairing, still recovering, still adapting, still growing. Uh-oh. Hold on. Let me get my phone. Hello. What did you say,
Hi, Max. How are you?
Good, thank you. How are you?
Are you back now?
I'm back. What did you say, please?
Okay. I apologize. I don't know where that cut out from. We'll probably have to revisit that one. If you would like to know what an intra is, comment below and we'll answer your question in the comments.
Yeah, for
Brilliant.
sure. And that's something we can probably debate about at some point. We won't do it today, but we will debate about it at some point because I think it's interesting. It's interesting to talk about. It's cool.
Absolutely. Max, are nuts high in protein?
I think nuts are one of my favorite things to talk about to people who are not completely new to nutrition because they kind of go against everything you typically learn overall when you're starting out, which is that, your foods that are lower in calories, like your vegetables and your fruits, also tend to be very high in micronutrients. So like the ratio between calories versus micronutrients is very good and very favorable. And then your foods that are very high in calories, like your chips and your chocolates and your lollies and everything, also tends to be very low in micronutrients, and the ratio between calorie to micronutrients is a bit out of whack. And you kind of learn that rule of thumb overall, and that tends to kind of play out. The outlier being nuts, in my opinion, overall, in the sense that nuts very high in calories, but also offer a lot of nutrients and a lot of positive things overall, really, to us. And I think it's interesting to look at what are we defining as what's high in protein? Is it protein versus carbohydrates and fats, or is it protein per calorie, like 1 gram, like the grams of protein per calories, or how are we going about it versus what's high in protein, like are legumes high in protein? Is it just protein per 100 grams? The nuts have, I don't know how much protein per 100 grams in them, but it's different way of thinking about it. And in my opinion, no, they're not high in protein.
Yeah, they're definitely not high protein. However, it's important to note that they do contain protein. So they can be a source of protein in meals. Yep. It's just if you're looking to squeeze every single ounce out of a meal in terms of total protein per calorie, they're not amazing.
Yeah.
However, they do provide a lot. So they provide a ton of essential fatty acids, which are very important. So they have a lot of positive fat things that we really need for our body. So things that we can't actually produce by our body ourselves, so that we need to get them exogenously from food, as well as a source of omega-3 fatty acids in the form of ALA, not EPA and DHA from the fishies, but ALA from the plant sources. So they can be really positive in terms of cardiovascular health and antioxidant properties overall. In terms of carbohydrate intake, they're very low GI, so really great for diabetes management, pretty much really great food, full stop. However, they can be quite high in energy because they do contain some fats. However, also very satiating. Overall, I put nuts in a good like S tier of food. However, not the best source of protein, because if you're relying on nuts for your protein as your main source, I worry that you're not going to get as much as would be optimal for your sport performance application without having some isolated source of protein, or exercising so much that you have the energy budget for increased energy from nuts, seeds, and things along those lines.
Yeah, and I'd even just be concerned that you're having too much protein. If you were having a significant amount of your protein from nuts, you're getting too much fat overall than what you want. Like having a lot of fat is fine, but it's not something that's ideal. Carbohydrates are our body's preferred fuel source, and they're what we function best at overall. And look, of course, people are going to differ. Some people prefer different things, and that's fine. But overall, you're going to be displacing a lot of carbohydrates if you're having a lot of nuts, purely because of the amount of fat they have in them. So yeah, it's great food. But I'd say if you're not a vegan, I wouldn't consider it a protein food. If you are a vegan, I think the dynamics change a little bit on that one, slightly.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say
absolutely.
It's a high protein food, but it's a food that contains protein that you need to be conscious of and probably consuming more regularly than if you weren't a vegan.
Yeah, in comparison to cucumber, yeah, it's a really good protein source. But in comparison to beef or chicken or whey protein powder, not the best.
Yeah, without a doubt. And I'd say similar goes for legumes a little bit.
Yeah, legumes are an interesting one. It's almost like they've replaced the fat content for fiber. So they're
and
quite
carbohydrates
fibrous.
almost.
Yeah, carbohydrates
Yeah.
increase, absolutely.
Yeah.
They are a pretty good protein source overall. Soy protein being one of the better protein sources for vegetarian and vegans overall. Just a little bit lower in leucine content. So look, if I was a vegetarian, the only thing that I would change about my diet in terms of if I'm looking to increase my total muscle protein synthesis is increase my total protein full stop. I wouldn't worry about supplementing with leucine independently. Your protein matters a lot more. And then of course, leucine is contained in a lot of different foods and a lot of different vegetarian sources as well. So just increasing your protein kind of ticks that box as well. So look, I wouldn't even stress about that. I'll just increase it by what would you say, Max, about 25%?
Yeah, maybe not even that high. Yeah. I would say really just for someone who is a vegan, if you're looking to do things to change your body composition, which inherently also means you're probably going to need to increase your protein, I'd say you need to be really, really comfortable with tofu and with soy products overall, because they're kind of going to be your best friend, really.
Yeah.
They're kind of your magic bullet, really, through that. There's nothing else like your soy protein in terms of the absorption rate is second to none for everything. All other sorts of animal-based products, so plant-based products, is like 70% absorption rate topping out at, whereas the soy protein is 99% absorption rate. It's also no, it's not. Wait, it's not a complete protein, is it?
It is. Ooh, now you're testing me. I actually want to have a separate podcast on that. Definitions and nuance of complete versus incomplete proteins is a parameters that we can look at. If not, stay tuned for the next podcast because I think we'll have a bit of a discussion.
Cool. Yeah. So yeah, that's going to need to be your best friend. And if you're a vegan or you're thinking about veganism, but you're like, if you're going through a transitional period, such as, like if you're someone who really cares about gaining muscle and then thinking about going vegan, you really need to ask yourself the question of how much tofu can I actually withstand? Because like for me, I like tofu, but I like it in small amounts. So if I was to do it, despite liking tofu, I'd never be able to consume enough to actually meet my protein requirements. And that might just be something you think about as well. Matthew, requirements is an interesting word. Someone who consumes a significant amount of protein, who's just a gen pop person, they go for a walk 3 to 4 times a week, they walk the dog, and that's about it. Their protein requirement is going to be significantly less than a bodybuilder. What would you say to someone who's having a lot of protein, say, let's say 2 grams per kilogram of body weight, who's just a gen pop person?
I had a really great question from that Instagram post that I did. And it was, hey, I am 80 kilos. I'm consuming 200 grams of protein per day. Is that too much? Doing the math, that means it's 2.5 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. Realistically, we don't see much of a benefit from going above 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight for natural individuals and even potentially low level of HRT and performance enhanced individuals. The real detriment that we have from going above that point is you're missing out and displacing fats, which we need for our diet in certain amounts, and carbohydrates, which can really fuel your workouts to provide a better stimulus overall. And if we're potentially missing either of those factors, there are a lot of micronutrients that we're missing from those situations. And I presume if you're at 2.5 grams per kilogram, you're most likely supplementing with a lot of protein powder throughout the day. Again, it's not exactly nutrient dense in terms of a bunch of other micronutrients. However, getting above 1.2 grams per kilogram, I would say, is really important for health span overall. I think the current Australian dietary guideline recommendations is on average about 0.8 grams per kilogram of protein. There's a lot more than I do, Max. But overall, that's to specifically avoid deficiency and disease associated with a reduction in protein intake. I would put it at least 1.2 for majority of individuals to ensure that their health span is their number one priority. Even if it's not to grow super high levels of muscle, which you definitely count on 1.2 grams per kilogram, it just sounds like why would you not go down 1.2? Because then you're getting some really nutrient dense sources. Even if you're getting it from plant proteins, you have a can of beans with a little bit of cheese on top. That is a really decent amount of protein, as well as you're getting a ton of fiber in that one. That ticks all the boxes from my area, which happens to be my lunch on most days.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, man, I like it. I think that's great. And the reason why I bring it up is because it sounds so different, right? And it sounds like a person who's a bodybuilder is potentially eating double or even more than the amount of protein someone that Gen Pop is probably going to be recommended to eat. And I think we need to distinguish between a few things here. We need to distinguish between requirements versus recommendations and how much the requirements change. Because anyway, I just find this interesting. So firstly, our requirements for protein are extremely, extremely low. They're just to keep the lights on and to stay alive. We don't need to consume much protein at all, but that's not necessarily what the recommendations would be to live a healthy, happy life. As Matt was saying, the recommendation for someone who's moderately sedentary, not doing too much physical activity, is going to be at around about that 1 to 1.2 grams per kilogram of body weight. So if you're 80 kilograms, it's going to be around about 80 to 85 grams or so of protein per day. Now, what's interesting is that that same 80 kilogram person would probably be recommended to eat around about 180 grams of protein per day if they were a bodybuilder who was using their muscles a lot, very physically active, and looking to gain as much muscle as they can. Now, that might be like, oh wow, that's crazy, because if the person who was in Gen Pop was consuming 180 grams of protein, our recommendations would probably be like, hey, let's like lower that a little bit because it seems excessively high. But the interesting thing about for the bodybuilder is that their requirements have actually gone up a lot. So it's like I don't even know how to verbalize this, Matthew. Like,
try this.
Because the requirements are going up, it's not actually like they've just decided to just go crazy and just like gone way above the recommendations. Their body literally requires more protein to keep the lights on. So not to keep the lights on,
So with the goal of gaining muscle, the requirements are increased in terms of, unless you're getting that above, I would say, at least 1.2 grams per kilogram of protein, the benefit that you're receiving from the exercise stimulus is going to be reduced, and you're leaving a lot on the table in terms of actually being able to build as much muscle as possible without diminishing your returns. Was that what you were trying to kind of convey?
Yeah, no, I like it. Yeah, I like it. For me, I just found it interesting. That because there was, if you're concerned about protein for whatever reason, and I personally don't think there's any reason to be concerned about protein and be fearful around that it's going to harm you in any way or whatever it is, but you may have that, and that's fine to have those reservations around that. You can think whatever you want, but it's important to understand that if you are very, very physically active, your literal requirements go up. So it's not like you're eating an excessive amount anyway. So like, for example, a 180 grams might seem excessive for that 80 kilogram bodybuilder person, but his requirements have significantly gone up. So an excessive amount for him would be, as you were saying, 220, 250 grams of protein, which is way above the requirements. Whereas 220 or 250 grams for just a Gen Pop person is like absurd, if that makes sense. Like that's like way, way, way super high. I just find that interesting.
It is very interesting. Absolutely. So the requirements to keep the lights on is increased because the allocated protein for the muscle repair is specifically a certain level, and then growth on top of that is additional, which I think is an extremely interesting point. So what does that actually look like for individuals in the population? That means that from my recommendations of 1.2 grams per kilogram of body weight, you're looking at protein at every single meal. So 3 to 4 meals out of the day. So that includes breakfast, lunch, dinner, and potentially the equivalent of a meal spread throughout the day in snacks, or a whole separate meal like I do after dinner, because I'm a night owl and I like big nummies. Generally, I think that it's probably a really great avenue to explore, including protein source in the morning, just because you go from having dinner time around 6 or 7 o'clock for almost a 12-hour fast from that time to your breakfast, where some people don't have any protein at all. It might be some toast with a spread of jam or something along those lines, which is very, very low protein, to the point where, okay, now you're extending that 12-hour fast to a potentially 14, 15, 16-hour fast, where we haven't received enough protein. We're potentially leaving a lot on the table for overall health and daily protein turnover rate, as well as, especially if you're a sport performance individual. That's like my first avenue is like, what are you having for breakfast? Let's explore that option. Can we include something protein? And it doesn't have to be like you don't have to eat chicken breast for breakfast, but you can include protein options that reach about a 20 gram to kind of hit your minimum effective volume of protein for that morning. Again, if you're a bodybuilder, sport performance, I would aim a little bit higher just from a kind of a safety perspective in terms of, hey, ticking off the box. But that's generally where I would start at. And again, look, don't stress over these things. Have a conversation with yourself or potentially a dietitian or nutrition professional and see what works best for you and your health goals.
Man, I love it. I love it. I think that's great. That's exactly what I got. That's great.
Beautiful. I'm
Thanks so
happy
much
to
for
wrap up
listening,
there, Max.
everyone.
Absolute legends. Thank
Me
you,
too.
everyone.
Me too.
Thank you so much for listening to the R.E.A.L Health and Nutrition podcast. The sponsor of today's show is you. You support the show by listening and using our services of dietitian consultations and performance coaching. We offer in-depth one-on-one consultations to help you achieve your health and performance goals. Any random bloke online can give you a generic meal plan where we here at R.E.A.L work collaboratively with you to reach your goals, making you feel heard and including you in your journey's planning. Our service offers tailored advice and can accompany meal plans and or realistic nutrition strategies, which can be booked via our website, www.recoveryexerciseandlifestyle.com. That's www.recoveryexerciseandlifestyle.com. Just a quick disclaimer, this podcast is for education, information, and general entertainment purposes only and does not constitute the practice of medical nutrition therapy or healthcare of any discipline. The content discussed in this podcast is not intended to be a substitute of professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Please review our terms of use via our website. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great day.